Good afternoon. My name is Alexander Kozlov. In today's presentation, I will demonstrate how sex in its entirety is embodied into our society from the economic point of view. Firstly, I will demonstrate the goals of the research. Then I will describe what sex phenomenon is. Afterwards, I will demonstrate the model, show the simulation results, and I will interpret them. So, the point of the research was to identify the patterns that are inherent to sexual intercourse and to construct a model of sexual relations in modern society. This model should explain firstly, when and why do people engage in these relations? Then the objective was to look at the society as a market for sex and to describe the behavior of demand and supply, if it is possible, and find stable, socially optimal amount of sex in the economy. But first, to begin with, let me define what sex really is. This process may be known to you under other names, like coitus or copulation. On a daily basis, however, people call it simply sex. One of the main characteristics of this activity is that it can only be done by two or more people. Everything that a human is doing on their own cannot be defined as sex. The main motivation for engaging in sexual activity is the physical and emotional pleasure and satisfaction. Generally, researchers distinguish four types of sex. The first one is anal sex. It is defined by thrusting an erect penis into the anus of the other person. The next type is vaginal sex, arguably the most prominent type of sexual activity in the literature. It encapsulates the process of thrusting an erect penis into a vagina. The third type is often referred to as oral. It is characterized by stimulating genitalia by a mouth, lips, tongue, and teeth. Stimulus of female genitalia is called cunnilingus, while penetration of a mouth by a penis is a fellatio. Finally, the last but not least includes fingering and other forms of coitus. For example, usage of a dildo. So, for simplicities, let us look at the mechanics behind sexual intercourse on the example of the vaginal intercourse. So, most commonly, the first stage of sex is foreplay. It includes some physically intimate and emotional acts, such as kisses, removal of clothing, and sometimes even oral sex. Foreplay may induce penile and clitoral erection. This this process is called sexual arousal. Female body can respond to it with engorged sexual tissues, such as nipples, vulva, vaginal walls, and, most importantly, lubricated vagina. In order for successful penetration to take place, males and females orient their hips in the way to sustain unconstrained rhythmic movement of the penis. The friction caused by this motion results in either ejaculation of both partners or only one partner. It concludes the intercourse. Overall, the median sex time is around 5.4 minutes. but large deviations up to over an hour are possible as well. Sex is generally an attribute of so-called relationships. Every human is capable of falling in love uh, or having a strong physical attraction to another person. On the basis of this feeling, two people begin their relationship and are socially treated as a couple. Typically, a pair of people tries to maintain their relationship as long as possible, prolong it even if the partners no longer satisfy each other. Another important characteristic of a typical relationship is fidelity, meaning that they are supposed to be faithful to each other. In case one of the partners had sexual intercourse with another person, the relationship usually ceases to exist. Taking into account all these factors, I have constructed a model. But to start with, let me outline certain facts that the model does not describe and make corresponding assumptions. Uh, so, the model looks at heterosexual couples only. There is no way one can have sexual intercourse with the person of the same sex. To be exact, only the relationship of cis men and women I examined. Then all agents are considered to be monogamic and loyal. Uh, they cannot fall in love and have sex with two or more people simultaneously. The model does not account for the burden of raising a child. For simplicity, all sexual acts have 100% contraception rate. It is also important that sexual intercourse is considered to be free. People do not have to pay each other and do not offer sex for money. These are all the necessary assumptions. Now we can move to the theoretical framework of the model. Let's start from scratch. Suppose there is a person who is either a man or a woman. Suppose we have a man. Let's call him Chuck. Each person is characterized by two parameters. The first one is attractiveness, which is measured on using some attractiveness scale. Chuck is a handsome guy and has the attractiveness of 87. Now let's invite another person, Daisy. She has an attractiveness of 62. The second parameter that everyone has is the threshold of attractiveness, above which the person of the opposite sex is considered attractive by the given person. It resembles the minimal acceptable level of attractiveness of another person to be suitable for sex and is measured on the same attractiveness scale. So here, Chuck's threshold is 60, and Daisy's is 70. In other words, these are their lower bound of preferences. If the person of the opposite sex is not as attractive, then this pair of people will not have sex. So the necessary condition for performing coitus is that both agents should find their partner attractive enough. In this case, as we see, both Chuck and Daisy find each other sufficiently attractive and agree on sexual intercourse. However, if Chuck's threshold was a bit higher, then Daisy becomes not attractive enough, and hence they will not have sex even if Daisy wanted to. So now we know how would people behave if they met each other for the first time. Uh, but what if there is a third person? Uh, let's call him Harvey. Now, if both Chuck and Harvey find Daisy attractive, then this induces some competition into the model. In case Daisy is interested in both of them, she should choose the one who is more attractive. Thus, Chuck has secured sex with Daisy. This is the general framework of the model. This interaction ends up with some people having sex and others not having sex. Let us develop the model further. Let us add time into our model. Suppose all the interactions that we have already mentioned happen in one period, suppose during 1 month. I assume this time is enough to start a relationship and maybe get rejected. With the introduction of time, some dynamics is added into the model. Let us look at the attractiveness dynamics first. Those people who had sexual intercourse in the previous period, their attractiveness falls. Since they become more relaxed, they are no longer in the search for a partner. They take care, they have less care of themselves. And those people who did not have any sexual intercourse in the previous period, they increase their attractiveness. For example, by working out or taking care of their face and their clothing. Similarly, moving on to the thresholds, in reality, preference tend to be more static than the appearance of the person. So their change happens less often. The threshold rises if the person had sex with a very attractive partner. And on the opposite, if the person had no sexual activity for 2 periods in a row, then the threshold falls because the person relaxes his preferences in a need for sex. Another aspect is the relationships. Agents do not forget about their previous sexual partner immediately. They continue to have sex with the same partner even if he or she is slightly below the threshold. But if one person, one of the partners, is significantly below the threshold, then their relationship ends and they start looking for other sexual partners. Now, after setting some rules, let's look what will happen to Chuck, Harvey, and Daisy after some time passes. How would they behave and how would their attractiveness change? So let's look at the simulation. We can see that Daisy was alternating partners because her attractiveness steadily falls. She is always in the relationship, and so she has no incentive to keep her attractiveness at the same level. Chuck and Harvey increased their attractiveness on the opposite, since the majority of their time they were not in the relationship, and they were fighting and competing for Daisy. Now let's look at the threshold dynamics. Uh, Here the trends are opposite. Chuck and Harvey, in turn, decrease their thresholds, since both are without a girlfriend for a long time while Daisy is in a relationship. When competing for being with her, men increase their attractiveness, and Daisy's standards rise as well, leading to the rise in her threshold. She demands more from them with each following relationship. This is a pretty simple case involving three people only. But what if there are many of them? Hundreds, for example. Let's look at it from the male perspective. Suppose every man can see and communicate with every woman that we've created. Then every man will have his own list of women with whom he wants to have sex, if any. Uh, this list is then narrowed because some women reject certain men immediately because they are below their threshold. And from this narrowed list, a man definitely chooses the most beautiful woman. However, he might not be the only candidate, and so, candidate for the sexual intercourse with her. And of course, she will choose the most attractive candidate as well, the most attractive male. And so, uh, men who were rejected during their first attempt, they do not give up and try to compete for the second best option from their list. In case of the second rejection, they stop the search and have no sex at all. Now that we have a lot of people with a net of relations between them, let's look at them from the economic perspective, as we look on the market. Firstly, let's define what is the market. In modern economics, this definition is broad. Market is a system of social relations in which people engage in exchange. It can be goods, services, money, no constraints are set. In our model, we definitely have a system of social relations in which people are the agents. It might not be that obvious, but the exchange is also present. Uh, Men and women offer sex from their side in exchange for sex from the other side. Thus, we can certainly call the cycle of relationships, which is natural to contemporary society, a market for sex. There are various types of the market. And which one of them are we looking at? So the main division factor is the presence of money on the market. Agents can exchange goods and services for money, or they can exchange goods and services for goods and services. These are barter markets. As we have mentioned, in the list of assumptions, sexual intercourse is not sold for money in our model. Thus, the market for sex is an example of a barter market. However, even if we look at a barter market, sex market is very unusual. People exchange sex for sex. The services are the same. Uh, it is the only good. And another peculiarity of this market is that the number of sellers and buyers is always the same. Each buyer is simultaneously a seller. Every man wants sex and every woman wants sex while offering it as well. Such markets rarely appear in the economic literature, and so it might be hard to analyze any supply and demand dynamics. But anyway, we will try to do so. Let us model a market for sex by creating 50 men and 50 women whose parameters have identical distribution. The rules of the model are the same, but we look at a large time span of 500 months or approximately 40 years. Firstly, let's look at the parameter of attractiveness. But for the sake of representation, let's use not bars, but simply dots. They are easier to keep track of. So now let's look at the simulation results. We can judge about how close our model is to reality by looking at its stability. In the long term, average attractiveness does not drift far from the initial point. Here we can also see what I denoted as attractiveness rotation. Very few individuals keep their attractiveness at constant level, but rather they switch from increasing to decreasing their attractiveness. And over the period of 40 years, they perform multiple such rotations, as we see. Let's define attractiveness as a price for sex. People who desire sex the most put a lot of effort into increasing their attractiveness, so they pay a higher price. In the first month of simulation, the scatter plot makes a list of people sorted by decreasing attractiveness. I'll show it now. Here, decreasing attractiveness. But then we can see that no matter what initial level of attractiveness was, individuals change it, and after several years, it is already impossible to distinguish who had a high attractiveness at the start. Thus, we can say that there is no persistent high or low valuation sex consumers. Therefore, the market does not exclude any low valuation consumers. All agents are present at the market in the long term. Due to these peculiarities of the market, there is no clear demand function. But maybe the supply relationship is more obvious. Now let's move on to the threshold dynamics. So let's look at the simulation. This parameter can be denoted as a selling price for sex. It is minimal effort a buyer has to make in order to receive sex as the good. So the level of thresholds is basically a market supply. However, similarly to the attractiveness, we cannot see any clear supply dynamics. Suppliers, as we see, uh, they drastically change their thresholds multiple times during a 40-year period. Thus, we can state that there is no well-defined demand and supply function on the market for sex. Despite us being unable to find the intersection of demand and supply, probably we can still find some stable equilibrium, some amount of sex that is inherent to society, equilibrium proportion of people having sex per month. In order to check for the presence of such equilibrium, I have observed the amount of people having sex at every period, and the results were really, really astounding. Let's look at them. Initially, sometime after the simulation starts running, people get to know each other, they adjust their appearance and expectations from other people. This is the period when the amount of sex is steadily cramping up. But then, after this time passes, the amount of sex starts following clear pattern that is recognizable to any economist. Let's look at it. Here we look at nothing else but the business cycle of sex. The cycle lasts for around 100 years or 100 months. It is over 8 years. That is similar to jugular cycles, which are the cycles of investment into fixed capital. Therefore, we can confidently say that there are some periods in history where the crisis of sex was witnessed, and other periods in history where the consumption of sex was at its peak. We can also try to answer the question, where are we on the cycle timeline now? We can use the proportion of sexually active people as a proxy for the share of people having sex per month. There is empirical evidence that the amount of sexually active people increases during the period of economic crisis. Therefore, we can expect overheating of sex market in Russia in the nearest future. Additionally, removal of COVID restrictions positively affects sexual dynamics as well. Thus, sexual activity is currently on the rise, and everything is in our hands. Everyone can benefit from the economic situation on the market for sex. To conclude the discussion, let me list the results that were demonstrated by this research. Firstly, the model of sexual relations was constructed, which is definitely restricted by certain assumptions, but nevertheless it is stable and close to reality. Secondly, Sex and relationships were examined from the economic perspective. Sex was defined as an extraordinary barter market, where agents offer sex in exchange for sex. No clear demand and supply dynamics were found, but another market property was discovered. And the market for sex has economic cycles, which are noticeable at multiple simulation seeds. This behavior can help us to predict future sexual activity, and generally, it gives us more understanding of what sex really is. Be positive about future trends. Have sex, and thank you for your attention.